At 2:14 a.m. on a quiet winter night, the emergency dispatcher in Lincoln County received a calm call from a woman named Carol Brown, who said her husband was not breathing and that she had just woken up and found him cold and unresponsive in their bed. And what made the operator pause was not what she said, but how she said it. Because there was no panic, no shaking voice, no crying, just slow, measured sentences as if she was reading instructions. And she told them her husband, Daniel Brown, was 56 years old, had gone to sleep around 10:30 after watching television, had no major medical issues that she knew of, and that she herself had slept through the night until she woke up at 2 and noticed he was not moving. And when the dispatcher asked when she last spoke to him, she answered, "I don't remember, maybe before sleep." And when asked if she tried CPR, she said no because he felt stiff already. And when asked if she could unlock the door for paramedics, she said the door was already unlocked because she always left it that way. And that detail would later return again and again, like a small stone in the shoe of every investigator who touched this case. Paramedics Jacob Hill and Thomas Rivera arrived 7 minutes later and found Daniel Brown lying flat on his back under the blanket, his arms straight at his sides, his face pale, lips slightly blue, eyes partially open and bulging in a way that experienced responders immediately recognize as a sign that death did not happen peacefully. And when they touched his skin, it was cool, not ice cold, but cool enough that Jacob Hill later said he knew within seconds that this man had not died moments before the call, but much earlier. And when they asked Carol Brown when she last heard him breathe, she said she had been sleeping deeply because she had taken her usual night medication and did not wake up at all. And when Thomas Rivera asked what medication that was, she hesitated and said, "Just my sleeping pill, nothing strong." And that hesitation was noted in the run sheet, even though at that moment no one accused her of anything, because people react differently to shock. The time of death was estimated on scene as somewhere between 11:30 p.m. and 12:30 p.m., based on body temperature, jaw stiffness, and the way lividity had settled across Daniel's back. But what confused Jacob Hill was that lividity was not fixed in the usual pattern for someone who had been lying still all night, because there were lighter patches along the shoulders and darker pooling lower on the back, suggesting the body had been moved slightly after death. And when he gently lifted Daniel's arm, it fell stiff, not floppy. And Carol Brown stood by the doorway with her arms crossed, not crying, not asking questions, just watching. And when the police officer on duty, Officer Mark Collins, arrived, he immediately noticed that the bed sheets were unusually neat for a man who supposedly died in his sleep, because most natural deaths involve some movement, gasping, clutching, or rolling. But here, the bed looked made, except for a shallow impression where Daniel lay. And when Collins asked Carol if her husband had a history of sleep apnea, heart disease, seizures, or night terrors, she said no, none at all. And then she added, almost casually, he snored sometimes, but nothing serious. And that addition would later contradict statements she made months earlier to her sister-in-law, Rebecca Moore, where she complained that Daniel stopped breathing at night and scared her, which raised an early red flag about consistency. At 3:02 a.m., Daniel Brown was officially pronounced dead, and the house was sealed for routine death investigation because there was no obvious sign of trauma, no blood, no broken furniture, no forced entry, and Carol Brown was allowed to sit in the kitchen with a blanket around her shoulders, where she told Officer Collins that she had gone to bed around 10:45 after taking her pill, and that she slept straight through until 2 o'clock and never once woke up, despite the fact that, according to the medical examiner, Daniel's death would have involved prolonged air hunger, muscle contraction, and involuntary gasping sounds that in quiet rooms are loud enough to wake light sleepers and sometimes even neighbors. And when Collins asked what sleeping pill she took, she finally said Zolpidem 10 milligrams, prescribed by her family doctor, Dr. Alan Weaver. And that dose is known to make people drowsy, but not unconscious, not deaf, and not immune to loud distress noises. And this would later become one of the most damaging scientific points in court. When the medical examiner, Dr. Louise Carter, arrived at dawn, she immediately noticed petechial hemorrhages around Daniel's eyes, tiny red dots caused by pressure during oxygen deprivation, and she noted bulging of the eyes, tongue slightly swollen, and a faint bruise under the jawline that could not be explained by normal sleep. And when she pressed the neck, she felt subtle, deep tissue firmness consistent with compression, not a heart attack, not a stroke. And when she asked Carol Brown if Daniel ever choked or vomited in his sleep, Carol said no. And when asked if he drank alcohol that night, she said 1 beer at most. And when toxicology later showed no alcohol in Daniel's blood, that was yet another inconsistency added to the growing list. By the time the autopsy was completed later that afternoon, the cause of death was listed as asphyxia pending investigation, which meant Daniel did not simply stop breathing on his own. Something prevented air from entering his lungs. And the question that now haunted everyone involved was simple and terrifying. How could someone lie next to a man dying like this and not wake up? And science does not allow easy answers based on feelings or personality, because sleep is measurable, awareness is measurable, sound thresholds are measurable, and zolpidem does not erase the brain's ability to react to danger sounds, especially from a person sharing the same bed. And in controlled sleep lab studies, subjects under similar doses still wake to choking, coughing, or screaming in the same room. And when prosecutors later recreated the timeline with independent sleep specialists, Dr. Hannah Lewis and Dr. Patrick O'Donnell, both testified that it would be extremely unlikely, bordering on impossible, for a healthy adult to sleep through the physical struggle of another adult dying by airway obstruction inches away. Phone records then added another layer, because Carol Brown's phone showed activity at 12:48 a.m., a short message outgoing to a contact saved as L, which was later identified as Leonard Price, a coworker she had been emotionally involved with. And when questioned, she said she must have sent it half asleep without remembering, but the message content read, "Is it done?" And that single sentence would change the direction of the entire case, because it placed her awake and mentally aware during the window when Daniel was most likely dying. And when investigators asked her why she did not call emergency services until 2:14 a.m., she said she didn't notice anything wrong earlier, and yet her phone activity, her movement data, and the position of the body all told a different story. And as one investigator later said, this was not about what she claimed to feel, it was about what the body proved happened. By the end of the first week, investigators no longer asked how Daniel Brown died. They asked how long Carol Brown stayed awake while it happened, and whether sleep was ever part of that night at all. And this is where the case stops being emotional and becomes purely scientific, because the body does not lie even when people do, and every minute detail from eye pressure to muscle stiffness to phone pings to drug effects began pointing in the same direction, that the woman who said she slept peacefully beside her husband may have been awake for every breath he struggled to take. The second phase of the investigation began with time, not emotions, because once the autopsy confirmed asphyxia, the only honest way forward was to rebuild the night, minute by minute. And this is where Carol Brown's claim of sleeping through everything began to collapse under simple, measurable facts that anyone can understand without medical training, because timestamps do not care about stories, and physics does not bend for sympathy. And the first anchor point was Daniel Brown's phone, which stopped moving at 11:52 p.m. when its internal motion sensor recorded a final short burst of activity consistent with a person shifting suddenly, and then nothing after that. Not even the tiny movements phones usually record when someone rolls in sleep. And this suggested that something abrupt happened around that time. And when investigators compared this with the smart mattress data the Browns used, which tracked sleep quality, they found that Daniel's side showed sharp, irregular pressure changes between 11:49 and 11:56 p.m., followed by a flat line, meaning no movement at all. And this was not normal sleep, because even deep sleep shows micro shifts every few minutes. And when experts explained this to the jury later, they used a simple example, saying even a sleeping child turns at least once an hour. Now, Carol Brown's side of the mattress told a different story, because it showed pressure release at 11:51 p.m., meaning she sat up or leaned away, and then pressure return at 12:03 a.m., meaning she lay back down.
And when asked about this, she said she had no memory of sitting up and must have moved unconsciously. But sleep specialists testified that sitting upright and staying there for over 10 minutes requires wakefulness and muscle coordination that does not occur during normal sleep or even medication-assisted sleep. And this alone destroyed the idea that she was completely unconscious during the critical window. And then came the sound evidence, which was uncomfortable but unavoidable because Daniel's death involved air hunger, which produces involuntary sounds like gasping, wheezing, choking, and throat-clicking sounds that can reach over 70 decibels in quiet rooms, which is louder than a normal conversation. And neighbors confirmed hearing a brief strange noise around midnight that they described as a muffled cough or choking sound that lasted several minutes and then stopped abruptly. And when investigators asked Carol Brown if she heard anything at all, she said no, not a sound. And that was the moment investigators stopped asking what if and started asking how. Then the medication argument was examined because Carol Brown insisted her sleeping pill kept her asleep and unaware, but pharmacy records showed her prescription was 5 milligrams, not 10, and blood tests showed only a low therapeutic level in her system, not enough to cause deep, unresponsive sleep. And Dr. Samuel Price, a toxicologist, testified that even double the dose would not block the brain's response to nearby distress sounds, especially from a spouse sharing the same bed. And he explained it in simple terms, saying sleeping pills make it easier to fall asleep. They do not turn off survival alarms. And this was reinforced by controlled lab studies where subjects under the same drug woke immediately to coughing, choking, or screaming audio played at much lower volumes than what Daniel would have produced. And jurors later said this was one of the most eye-opening moments because it removed mystery and replaced it with plain logic. The position of Daniel's body added another layer because lividity patterns showed gravity pooling had shifted, meaning his position changed after death, and this was confirmed by faint sheet creases that did not align with where his body was found. And investigators demonstrated this by laying a weighted mannequin on the bed and recreating the creases and showing that the only way those marks formed was if Daniel had been turned slightly and straightened after death. And when Carol was asked why she would move her husband, she said she never touched him, and that contradicted the physical evidence again and again. And the neck bruising was re-examined, not as a dramatic injury, but as pressure marks consistent with sustained force over several minutes, not a sudden collapse, not choking on food, not a medical event. And when investigators asked Carol if she tried to wake him by shaking his shoulders, she said she only touched his arm briefly, which could not explain the deeper tissue findings. And by now, the pattern was clear. Every explanation failed when matched against reality. Phone data then sealed the timeline because Carol Brown's phone showed screen activation at 11:47 p.m., 12:02 a.m., and 12:48 a.m., with typing activity during the first two periods, and movement data showing she walked to the bathroom and back. And when confronted, she said she must have checked the time half asleep, but forensic phone analysts explained that typing coherent messages and walking without stumbling requires awareness and coordination, and the message sent at 12:02 a.m. to Leonard Price saying, "Just wait," was particularly damaging because it showed anticipation, not confusion. And when asked what she meant, she could not explain it without contradicting earlier statements. And the jury later said it felt like watching someone sink deeper the more they tried to swim. One of the most powerful moments came when investigators recreated the bedroom environment during a sound test, using the same mattress, same bedding, same room dimensions, and a recording of controlled choking sounds played at measured volumes, and every volunteer, even those who claimed to be heavy sleepers, woke within seconds, and one volunteer, under a similar sleeping pill dose, woke immediately and covered their ears instinctively. And this was not theatrical. It was boring, scientific repetition, and that is why it worked, because it showed that Carol Brown's version of events required her to be biologically different from every human tested being, and courts do not accept miracles as explanations. Then motive entered, quietly, without drama, because investigators learned Daniel Brown had recently changed his life insurance beneficiary, and Carol stood to lose significant financial security. and text messages showed increasing arguments about money and separation, and this was not presented as character assassination, but as context, because behavior before death matters, and when combined with opportunity, awareness, and physical evidence, it completed the picture. And prosecutors did not need to say she killed him. They only needed to show she was awake, aware, and did nothing while he died, and that sleeping through it was not just unlikely, it was scientifically impossible. By the end of part 2 of the investigation, the question was no longer how could Mrs. Brown sleep while her husband was dying, but why she needed everyone to believe she did. And that shift changed everything, because sleep was no longer the defense, it was the story that collapsed under light and time and simple measurable truth. And when jurors later spoke, they said the evidence did not shock them with gore or drama, it shocked them because it made sense, and that is what stayed with them long after the courtroom emptied. If this story made you pause and rethink what you think you know about sleep science and hidden evidence, then subscribe to the channel for more real cases explained in simple words. Leave a comment with your thoughts because discussion keeps these stories alive, and share this video so others can understand how science speaks when silence tries to hide the truth.
As the case moved deeper, the investigators stopped focusing only on the night of death and began widening the lens, because behavior before and after an incident often explains what happens during it. And this is where Carol Brown's actions began to look less like shock and more like control and planning. And the first thing that stood out was how quickly she began managing the narrative, because within 12 hours of Daniel Brown being pronounced dead, she had already called his brother, Michael Brown, and told him Daniel passed peacefully in his sleep from a heart issue, even though the medical examiner had clearly told her no cause of death had been determined yet. And when asked later why she said that, she replied she just assumed. And that assumption mattered because it showed she was already steering expectations away from anything suspicious. And when Michael arrived at the house later that day, he noticed that the bed sheets had been changed and washed, and Carol said she could not stand the smell of death. But investigators explained that bodies do not smell within hours, and that washing sheets that early destroys evidence. And when confronted with that fact, Carol said she was not thinking clearly, which became her default answer whenever logic cornered her. Then came the financial behavior, because banks do not lie. And records showed Carol accessed Daniel's individual savings account online at 9:18 a.m. the same morning he died, and transferred a significant amount to a joint account. And when asked why, she said she needed money for funeral expenses. But investigators pointed out that no funeral arrangements had been made yet, and that funeral homes had not even been contacted. And that transfer happened before she called Daniel's employer or insurance provider, which showed priority and awareness. And when questioned about this by Detective Laura Jensen, Carol became defensive and said people grieve differently. And that phrase again tried to replace facts with emotion, but the timeline did not move. The forensic psychologist, Dr. Nina Caldwell, was brought in not to diagnose, but to analyze consistency and response patterns, and she noted that Carol's emotional displays were delayed and situational, meaning she cried when observed and became flat when conversations turned technical. And when shown photos of the bedroom setup, she corrected small details like pillow placement, which suggested strong memory retention, not dissociation. And when asked to recount the night, she repeated the same phrases word for word across interviews, which indicates rehearsal, not confusion. And jurors later found this chilling because genuine memory usually shifts slightly, while rehearsed stories stay rigid. Another overlooked detail came from the bathroom because luminol testing revealed cleaned water splashes and partial footprints leading from the bedroom to the sink and back. And this suggested washing hands or arms. And Carol said she did not wash anything during the night, but investigators showed that the cleaning occurred after midnight before morning activity. And when asked again, she said she might have rinsed her face, which did not explain the pattern. And when detectives asked why she did not mention that earlier, she said she forgot. And forgetting minor actions is normal, but forgetting actions that happen during a life-altering event is not common, especially when those actions align with physical evidence.
Sleep science experts were again consulted, and they explained something simple but powerful, that sleeping beside someone creates synchronized micro-awareness, where partners subconsciously register each other's breathing and movement. And when that rhythm stops, the brain notices, even in sleep. And this is why parents wake when babies stop breathing, and why spouses wake when snoring stops suddenly. And Dr. Oliver Grant explained it using an everyday example, saying if a ceiling fan stops in the middle of the night, people wake not because of noise, but because of sudden silence. And Daniel's breathing stopping after prolonged distress would have created exactly that kind of interruption. And when asked to demonstrate this, Carol had no response other than repeating that she slept deeply, which again asked the jury to believe she was the exception to basic human wiring. The autopsy was revisited with fresh eyes and new consultants, and Dr. Renee Walsh pointed out that Daniel had defensive muscle contractions in his forearms, meaning his body was actively struggling, and that kind of struggle shakes a mattress and produces vibrations that travel through shared bedding, and even light sleepers feel it, and heavy sleepers still respond with repositioning. And when mattress data showed Carol sat upright during this period, the implication became unavoidable. She was awake during the struggle and chose not to intervene. And when prosecutors presented this sequence, they did not accuse, they simply asked the jury to follow the movement data and ask themselves if sitting up and watching someone struggle could be confused with sleep. Then came the delayed emergency call, which was dissected second by second, and audio analysis showed Carol's breathing was steady during the call, not rapid, not panicked. And when the dispatcher instructed her to attempt CPR, she didn't even approach the bed and said he was too stiff already. And paramedics testified that stiffness that strong develops after a significant time, not minutes, and that meant Carol likely checked Daniel earlier and waited. And when asked why she waited, she had no explanation that did not contradict another statement. And at that point, even her defense attorneys stopped emphasizing sleep and began emphasizing uncertainty, which was a quiet admission that sleep could no longer stand. Witnesses added weight without drama because Daniel's coworker Stephen Hall testified that Daniel had confided fears about sleeping at home due to escalating arguments, and his sister-in-law Rebecca Moore testified that Carol once joked that sleeping pills make you miss everything. And while jokes are not evidence, they become context when paired with behavior and data. And the court never relied on a single shocking fact, but on dozens of small, ordinary facts that stacked until they became impossible to ignore. By the end of this phase, investigators no longer needed to explain how someone could sleep through a death, because the evidence showed she did not, and the case became about omission, not action, about awareness without response, and about how silence can be louder than screams. And this realization changed the tone of the courtroom, because the story was no longer mysterious, it was disturbingly clear. And the most unsettling part was that nothing supernatural or extreme was required, only the choice to stay still and let time do the rest. And that is what stayed with everyone who studied the case long after the evidence was packed away.
As the trial moved forward, the defense shifted strategy because by now, sleep could no longer survive contact with data. So instead, they tried to introduce doubt by saying maybe Daniel Brown's death happened suddenly and quietly, and maybe there was no struggle at all. But this argument collapsed the moment the medical examiner returned to the stand and explained in plain words that asphyxia is not silent and not instant, and that even in cases where pressure is applied quickly, the body reacts with reflex movements, gasps, and muscle tightening. And Daniel's body showed all of those signs, and she explained it using an everyday comparison, saying it is like trying to hold your breath while running. Your body fights back automatically, and no pill turns that off. And when jurors asked whether someone beside him would notice, she answered yes without hesitation and said even someone in the next room would likely hear it. And this simplicity made the defense's theory feel disconnected from reality.
Attention then turned to Carol Brown's behavior during police interviews because video recordings showed subtle but telling patterns, such as her correcting investigators before questions were finished, and her using technical language she should not normally know, such as using the word asphyxiation before it was officially disclosed. And when Detective Erin Miles asked her where she heard that term, she said she saw it on television, but investigators confirmed no media had reported it yet. And this suggested premature knowledge, and again, it was not one dramatic lie, but another thread added to the web. The prosecution then presented an overlooked but powerful detail: the pillow and bedding fibers, because microscopic examination showed compressed fiber patterns consistent with prolonged pressure rather than normal sleep contact, and those fibers matched a pillow found in the washing machine later that morning. And Carol said she washed all bedding together out of habit, but investigators demonstrated that the pillowcase from Daniel's side had been washed separately and earlier based on detergent residue and wash cycle timing. And when asked why she separated it, she said she did not remember doing so, and this was yet another example of selective memory failing exactly where evidence appeared. Another witness came from an unexpected place, the pharmacist Maria Gonzalez, who filled Carol's prescriptions, and she testified that Carol had asked detailed questions weeks earlier about whether sleeping pills could make someone unaware of emergencies and whether they could prevent waking. And the pharmacist said she explained clearly that they do not, and that Carol seemed disappointed by that answer. And this testimony landed heavily because it showed forethought, not confusion. And when defense objected, the judge allowed it because it went to knowledge, not intent, and knowledge was central to the question of sleep. Investigators also examined Carol's internet history, which showed searches in the days prior, including phrases like "how long until stiffness sets in after death," and "can someone die quietly in their sleep," and "does snoring stop before death?" And while searches alone do not prove action, they do show curiosity and timing. And when asked about these searches, Carol said she often read random things online, but experts testified that random curiosity usually spans topics, not a tight cluster directly related to a spouse's death. And again, it was pattern, not coincidence, that mattered. The most striking moment for many jurors came during testimony from a former emergency dispatcher, Lisa Turner, who analyzed the 911 call and explained that callers who discover a loved one unresponsive almost always interrupt the dispatcher, cry, ask questions, or beg for help, while Carol followed instructions mechanically and volunteered unnecessary details like the door being unlocked and the house being quiet. And Turner explained that this type of call is more consistent with someone reporting an event they already processed, not someone encountering it for the first time. And she made it clear this was not about grief style, but about cognitive load and emotional immediacy. And jurors later said this helped them understand why the call felt wrong, even if they could not initially explain why. Then came the timeline gap, which investigators labeled the silent window, because between 11:50 p.m. and 2:14 a.m., Carol's phone showed activity, movement, and wakefulness, yet there was no emergency call, no attempt to help, and no explanation that fit all data points. And prosecutors laid this out visually, minute by minute, showing Daniel's movement stopping, Carol sitting up, Carol moving to the bathroom, Carol sending messages, Carol lying back down and then waiting over an hour before calling for help. And they asked one simple question: why wait if you just woke up? And the defense had no answer that aligned with evidence. Expert testimony from Dr. Leon Foster, a sleep neurologist, finally closed the door on the sleep claim entirely because he explained that even in rare parasomnias, people respond to loud distress from loved ones, and that there is no documented case of a healthy adult sleeping through prolonged nearby asphyxia without alcohol or sedatives far stronger than what Carol took. And he stated clearly that for her story to be true, she would have to experience a level of unresponsiveness inconsistent with her medical history, her drug levels, and her recorded behavior that night. And this statement was not dramatic, it was calm, clinical, and devastating. As the courtroom absorbed this information, the narrative shifted completely, because the case was no longer about whether Carol killed her husband with her hands, but whether she knowingly allowed him to die, and whether claiming sleep was an attempt to erase responsibility. And this distinction mattered because it showed how omission can be as powerful as action, and how silence can be chosen. And when prosecutors ended the day, they reminded the jury that the question was never how someone could sleep through such a death, but why someone needed others to believe they did. And by this point, the answer no longer felt mysterious, it felt deliberate. And that realization sat heavy in the room as everyone understood that the truth had been built not from emotion, but from ordinary facts lined up one by one until denial could no longer stand.
As deliberations approached, the focus narrowed further because by now the evidence had answered every scientific question, and what remained was intent, inferred through behavior and timing. And the prosecution made it clear they were not asking the jury to imagine anything extreme or cinematic, but to look at ordinary human reactions that did not occur. And that absence became the loudest evidence of all. Because when someone discovers a loved one dying, they touch, they shake, they shout, they call for help immediately. And none of those things happened in the critical window. And when Carol Brown was asked why she did not even attempt to wake Daniel earlier, despite sitting upright and moving around, she said she thought he was sleeping deeply. And that explanation collapsed instantly because Daniel's breathing had stopped irregularly and then completely. And sleep does not look like that. And investigators demonstrated this by playing recordings of normal sleep breathing compared to air hunger sounds. And jurors did not need medical training to hear the difference. And many later said this was the moment they stopped trying to rationalize her behavior. The defense attempted one last angle, suggesting Carol may have frozen psychologically, and that shock could explain inaction. But the prosecution dismantled this calmly by pointing out that freeze responses occur in immediate danger, not during prolonged periods where a person completes multiple tasks, sends messages, walks around, and waits. And Dr. Caldwell returned to explain that freezing does not involve organized behavior or delayed reporting, and that Carol's actions showed planning, not paralysis. And this explanation resonated because it matched what everyone saw on the phone data and home sensors and audio analysis. Another critical witness was the medical examiner's assistant, Paul Richter, who testified about rigor progression. And he explained in simple language that when Carol said Daniel was already stiff at 2 a.m., that meant death occurred much earlier, and that stiffness does not appear suddenly. And Richter stated that Carol would have noticed changes much sooner if she had checked, and this raised the unavoidable conclusion that she likely did check earlier and chose not to act. And when defense asked whether stiffness could vary, Richter answered yes, but not enough to erase an hour or more. And jurors later said this made time itself feel like a witness. The prosecution also highlighted Carol's choice of words during interviews because she consistently used past tense when referring to Daniel before his death was confirmed, and said things like, "he was lying there," instead of "he is lying there." And linguistic experts testified that such phrasing often reflects subconscious certainty, and while language alone does not convict, it supports other evidence. And again, this was about accumulation, not a single smoking gun. One subtle but powerful detail came from Carol's phone counter, because it showed she walked exactly 18 steps from the bed to the bathroom multiple times that night. And investigators mapped those steps and showed that the path passed directly by Daniel's side of the bed, and they asked whether it was possible to walk past a dying person gasping and not notice. And the answer from multiple experts was no, unless you deliberately avoided looking. And this framed the case not as accident, but as choice. The jury also heard from Daniel's primary care physician, Dr. Robert Kim, who testified that Daniel had no condition that would cause sudden silent death, and that he was physically capable and healthy. And this removed the last refuge of natural causes.
And Dr. Kim added that Daniel had recently expressed fear about sleeping after arguments, which added emotional weight without sensationalism, because it showed Daniel sensed danger, even if he could not articulate it fully. As closing arguments began, the prosecution did something unusual. They replayed the 911 call without commentary and let silence fill the room. And jurors listened again to Carol's steady breathing, calm tone, and lack of urgency. And then they contrasted it with calls from unrelated cases, where callers screamed, begged, and cried. And this comparison did not accuse, it simply allowed listeners to feel the difference. And many jurors later said this moment stayed with them more than any photograph or chart. The defense argued that absence of action is not proof of intent, and that no one saw Carol harm Daniel, and that doubt must favor the accused. But the prosecution responded that the law does not require a witness to every moment, only that the evidence forms a consistent whole. And they reminded the jury that Carol's story required ignoring mattress data, phone data, sound evidence, medication science, body changes, and common human behavior all at once, and believing that she alone slept through something no tested human could. And they asked whether doubt still remained, or whether it had been replaced by clarity. By the end of Part 5, the case had transformed from a question of mystery into one of accountability, and the jury was left with a simple understanding that Daniel Brown did not die quietly alone in the night, but died while someone was awake nearby and chose not to intervene, and that the claim of sleep was not a shield of innocence, but a constructed explanation that unraveled under light and time and the weight of ordinary facts. And as the jury retired to deliberate, the courtroom held a silence heavier than any argument, because everyone understood that what was being judged was not just an act, but a decision made minute by minute while a life faded inches away. When the jury returned, the courtroom was silent in a way that felt final, because by this point, no one expected surprise, only confirmation. And when the verdict was read, it was not dramatic, it was steady and deliberate. And it reflected exactly how the case had unfolded, piece by piece, without emotion driving it. And the jurors later explained that they did not decide based on sympathy, anger, or imagination, but on impossibility. Because for Carol Brown's story to be true, too many things had to fail at once: biology, technology, human instinct, and time itself. And courts are built to recognize patterns, not miracles. And this was not a miracle. It was a choice stretched over minutes that turned into hours. After the verdict, investigators finally spoke openly about what disturbed them most, and it was not the medical findings or the messages or the financial behavior, but the stillness. Because Daniel Brown did not collapse suddenly, and he did not die silently. He struggled, and his body reacted exactly as human bodies always do. And the evidence showed someone was awake beside him while that happened, and that awareness without action became the center of accountability. And the court made it clear that sleeping through death was never the crime, but claiming sleep when evidence proved wakefulness was what revealed intent. During sentencing, the judge addressed Carol Brown directly and said that this case was not about rage or violence, but about indifference, and that indifference can be just as lethal. And the judge explained in plain words that when a person is aware of a life-threatening situation and chooses to do nothing, the law does not see innocence, it sees responsibility. And this statement resonated because it stripped away complexity and left only truth. And Carol showed no reaction beyond a slight tightening of her jaw, which matched the pattern jurors had seen throughout the trial. Experts later used this case in training seminars because it demonstrated how modern evidence works together. Mattress sensors, phone data, sound analysis, drug science, movement tracking, and human behavior. And none of these alone would have convicted anyone, but together they formed a story that could not be escaped. And investigators emphasized that technology did not replace humanity here, it revealed it. Because the data showed when a person chose to move, chose to wait, chose to stay silent. And that is why this case unsettled so many people, because it showed how easily ordinary actions become evidence when truth is tested. What also shocked many viewers was how simple the conclusion was once everything was laid out. Because there was no need for speculation and no need for graphic detail, the science spoke quietly and consistently, and it answered the question that had first drawn attention. How could Mrs. Brown sleep while her husband was dying? And the answer was she did not, and the evidence showed that clearly and relentlessly. And the reason that realization hits so hard is because it forces people to confront an uncomfortable truth, that awareness carries duty, and silence can be chosen, and sleep can be claimed, but time remembers everything. In interviews after the trial, jurors said the moment that stayed with them was not the verdict, but the realization that Daniel Brown's last moments were not unseen, and that someone nearby knew something was wrong and waited, and that waiting is what defined the case. And they said it changed how they think about responsibility, because it showed that harm does not always come from action. Sometimes it comes from refusal to act. And that is harder to accept because it feels ordinary, and that is exactly why it matters. The case closed without celebration and without relief because there was none to be had, but it left behind a clear lesson that investigators now teach openly when explaining suspicious deaths, that claims must match physics, behavior must match biology, and stories must match time. And when they do not, the truth eventually surfaces, not loudly but steadily until it cannot be ignored. And this is why science remains the quiet witness that never sleeps. If this case made you pause and rethink what you believe about silence, sleep, and responsibility, then subscribe to the channel for more real cases explained in simple words. Share this story so others can understand how evidence reveals truth, and leave a comment with your thoughts because discussion keeps these lessons alive, and awareness can make the difference between assumption and understanding.